1984. This book is more than 75 years old, but even as time passes, something strange repeats itself over and over again with this book. Every time the world starts to feel a little too weird, thousands of people go back to buy it. But why this book? Always the same. 1984. Because there are moments when it stops feeling like a novel and becomes a mirror of reality. 1984 is not just a story about dictatorships, censorship, or surveillance. It's about something sneakier. The moment when words stop meaning what they mean. That moment when reality submits to narrative. When reality becomes negotiable. A world where the big brother at the top gets to decide what's true, what happened, and what you're allowed to think about it. George Orwell understood something essential before anyone else, that the most perfect form of power is not the one that forces you into silence, but the one that makes you doubt what you see with your own eyes. And that's why, 75 years later, 1984 is still frightening, because its central question remains intact. What happens to a society when lies stop hiding and start demanding that we call them truth? In June 2013, Edward Snowden, an American intelligence analyst, leaked to the press the best-kept secret in the United States. The United States government was massively spying on the communications of millions of citizens through an agency called the NSA. Within 24 hours, sales of 1984 on Amazon rose by 6,000%. In January 2017, Donald Trump was inaugurated as President of the United States for the first time. In 4 days, sales of the book increased by 10,000%. The publisher had to urgently reprint 75,000 copies. February 2022, Russia invades Ukraine, calls it a special military operation, and 1984 becomes the most downloaded work of fiction in Russia, a book from 1949. In 2022, make it make sense. There are books that age well, and then there's this one, which doesn't age at all. Every time the world regresses or feels threatened, every time someone in power decides that reality can be rewritten, people go back to buy it, as if Orwell had left behind the instructions for something we still don't quite know how to prevent. But here's what I actually want to know. How does one human being end up writing something like this? What did Orwell have to see, suffer through, and reluctantly learn to get so terrifyingly good at predicting the playbook of power? To answer that, we must travel to an English boarding school in 1911. George Orwell was not born like George Orwell. He was born Eric Arthur Blair, and I want to start there because it matters more than it seems. Although, I'll admit it's also a great way to open a video. The man had a secret name, very mysterious, very clickable, but it actually does matter. Despite being English, he was born in British India as his father served as a colonial officer, but it did not last long, and the family returned to England. And there began Eric's real education. At 8 years old, he entered St. Cyprian's on a scholarship. His parents couldn't afford it, and the headmaster made sure Eric never forgot that. Years later, Orwell would write about those years in an essay so devastating he considered it too dangerous to publish during his lifetime. I titled it with an ironic phrase, such were the joys. What he described inside was anything but joyful. Arbitrary punishments, public humiliations, a system where your family's money determined how you were treated, and an authority that rewarded obedience and crushed any form of independent thought. What he learned there was not to hate his teachers. He learned something far more useful, that power does not need to justify itself, only to impose itself, and that the most respectable institutions can perfectly conceal, wrapped in tradition and discipline, some of the most effective ways of subjugating a human being. From St. Cyprian's, he went on with a scholarship to Eton, the most exclusive school in England. Academically, he finished 138th out of 167 students. It was not what you would call a brilliant career, but that wasn't what he was aiming for. Without Oxford, without Cambridge, without family money, there was really only one path for someone like Blair. In 1922, at the age of 19, he enlisted in the Imperial Police in Burma. For 5 years, he patrolled an occupied country, supervised arrests, witnessed executions, and, through his daily presence, administered the violence of the empire. Years later, he would write about that period with a frankness that still feels uncomfortable. He had been part of the real machinery of despotism. He understood that. There are writers who write about oppression from their desks, but Blair enforced it for 5 years, and that gave him something armchair intellectuals rarely have, knowing exactly what the system looks like from the inside, how it thinks, how it justifies itself, something you don't learn from books. In 1927, at 24, he returned to Europe with no job, no plan, and a very concrete sense of guilt he didn't quite know how to manage. And he made a decision no one understood. He chose to go to the bottom. He worked as a dishwasher in Paris restaurants. He slept in shelters in London. He lived for months among the poorest people in 2 of the richest cities in the world. The result was his first book, Down and Out in Paris and London, the story of a man who voluntarily immerses himself in poverty to understand it from within, and with a conclusion that changes everything. Misery is not an accident, it is a system. It was 1933. He signed it for the first time with the name by which he would go down in history, George Orwell. Orwell. Eric Blair had ceased to exist, but he still lacked the experience that would define his life and his work. Spain. December 1936. Orwell has spent years writing about poverty, empire, injustice, and suddenly, he leaves his desk, gets on a train to Barcelona. He has decided he will not write about war. He will fight in it. Spain has been burning for months. A group of generals had attempted to overthrow the Republican government, among them Francisco Franco. What they expected to be a quick coup had turned into a brutal civil war. Orwell chose a side, and within that side, he chose the most uncomfortable faction, the POUM, Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, a revolutionary left-wing party that defended workers' revolution above all else. It wasn't the most powerful or the best armed. It was the most honest about its ideas in his view. What matters here is this: Orwell did not arrive in Spain as a correspondent observing from a safe distance. He arrived as a soldier with a Mauser rifle, no helmet, no bayonet, and 15 cartridges. He was already someone who had decided there are things worth fighting for. He spent months in the trenches of the Aragon front with comrades who were 17 years old and didn't know how to load a weapon. But he also experienced something he had never known before: real equality between people. In the POUM militias, there were no visible ranks, no salutes, no differences in treatment. A Catalan worker and an English writer ate the same food, slept in the same place, and earned the same pay. He told it all in Homage to Catalonia. The trenches, the cold, the strange and genuine equality among the militias, and the shot. Yes, the shot. On May 20th, 1937, a sniper's bullet passed through his neck, a few millimeters to the left, and he would not have lived to tell it. But what truly changed him was not the bullet. When he returned to Barcelona to recover, the POUM had been declared illegal. Stalin wanted to control the republic alone, but the POUM refused to obey his orders. That made them enemies. Communist newspapers across Europe began publishing that they were agents of Franco. Orwell read it. He knew it was a lie. He had been there. The leaders were arrested. Andres Nin, the founder, was kidnapped by Soviet agents and murdered. Orwell later wrote, "If there is one depressing lesson I have learned from this war, it is that the left-wing press is as false and dishonest as the right-wing press." That sentence was written by someone who had gone to Spain to defend the Republic, to fight for the left with a rifle. Not a conservative, not a detached skeptic. Someone who believed, who fought, who was shot, and who finally understood that lies have no ideology. That is precisely why his words still sting 80 years later. Orwell left Spain fleeing, literally. The police had an arrest warrant for him. He crossed the French border by train, sitting in the dining car and posing as a tourist. He arrived in England with a wound in his neck, a damaged voice, and a certainty that would never leave him. The enemy you don't recognize is the most dangerous. A realization that would decisively shape what he was about to tell the world. November 1943. Orwell sits down again at his typewriter. He has an idea he has been holding onto for 6 years. A fable. Pigs who seize power on a farm and turn revolution into tyranny. At first, all animals are equal. That is the promise of revolution. But there is a sentence painted on the wall of the farm at the end. A sentence that sums up everything Orwell had lived through in Spain, in Burma, in the trenches. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Anyone who had read the newspapers in recent years would have understood exactly what it was about. In February 1944, he finished the manuscript. He titled it Animal Farm, and that's when the real problem began. The first publisher he sent it to was Victor Gollancz. The response was quick. "I cannot publish a general attack of this nature," he said. Next came Jonathan Cape, owner of one of the most prestigious publishing houses in England. He advised against publishing it, saying it would damage relations with Russia. He even suggested it might be less offensive if the dominant animals were not pigs. Then it went to T.S. Eliot, the most influential poet in England and director at Faber and Faber, one of the country's major publishers. He admitted the writing was brilliant and then rejected it. 3 prestigious publishers, 3 resounding rejections. Every single one of them acknowledged that the work was magnificent, but all, in different words, told him the same thing. It wasn't the right time. Publishing it would harm the alliance with Stalin, an ally in World War II. In other words, censorship didn't come from the government. It came from the publishers themselves, who censored voluntarily so as not to upset power. Orwell called them circus dogs that jump before the whip cracks. There's a lot of that in 1984, and you could argue even today. Animal Farm was finally published in August 1945. The war had ended. Stalin was no longer a necessary ally, and the book became an immediate success. But Orwell was already thinking about something else. He had had a novel in mind for years, darker than the fable, more precise, more personal. In 1946, he made a decision no one understood. He moved to Jura. Jura is a Scottish island in the North Atlantic, remote, cold, without electricity or heating, with a road that ends halfway and the rest accessible only on foot or by boat. Orwell chose the most isolated house on the island. There, he wrote 1984. He did it knowing he had tuberculosis, knowing he was dying. The doctors recommended rest. He spent 12 hours a day writing. He finished the manuscript in December 1948. By then, he could barely stand. The book was published on June 8, 1949. Orwell died shortly after on January 21, 1950. He was 46 years old. Orwell knew he didn't have much time, and that he had something important to say that could not wait. His book was, in reality, a warning, because 1984 is not a science fiction novel. It is not a dystopia imagined from scratch. It is an inventory, a list of things Orwell had already seen and lived, things that had already happened and only needed a name. He gave names to 5 ideas. 5 concepts that did not exist before this book and that we use today, often without knowing he invented them. Big Brother, the Ministry of Truth, Newspeak, Room 101, and Doublethink. All of them are still with us. In the book, Big Brother is a face on posters, on screens, on every wall. It never seems like a real person. No one knows if he truly exists, and that is exactly what makes him powerful. Orwell built him by looking at Stalin, at Hitler, at any leader the state turns into a symbol rather than a person. Because when power loses its face, you can no longer attack it. You can only fear it. The phrase that sums it all up, Big Brother is watching you. It doesn't say what he does, only that he watches. That is enough. Today, Big Brother isn't on a poster. He's in your phone, in the algorithm that knows what you're going to search before you search it, in the facial recognition cameras deployed in cities across China, the United Kingdom, and the United States. There is only one difference from Orwell's world. In 1984, people knew they were being watched. Today, most seem to have forgotten. But watching is not enough. For power to be total, it's not enough to see what you do. It must control what you remember. That is the job of the Ministry of Truth. And no, it does not produce truth. It produces the official version of events. Orwell didn't imagine this. He lived it. He worked at the BBC between 1941 and 1943, writing propaganda during the war, and he knew that this way of manipulating reality was nothing new. This photograph shows a speech by Lenin in 1920. On the steps beside the platform, to his right, stands Leon Trotsky, commander of the Red Army, one of the architects of the revolution. And this is the same photograph retouched, the official version. Trotsky is gone. Where there was once a man, now there is only a wooden staircase. Because in 1929, Stalin expelled him from the party, sent him into exile, and ordered that he be erased from history. Today we call it disinformation, fake news, or alternative facts. Whoever controls the past defines the future. And no, you no longer need a ministry. In January 2025, Trump pardoned more than 100 people convicted for the January 6th, 2021 Capitol attack. Days later, the Department of Justice removed from its website the entire judicial database with all those cases, charges, convictions, evidence. First he pardoned them, then he erased the evidence of what they had done. The executive order that justified it was called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. Orwell would have recognized it instantly. But rewriting facts is not enough. If people still have the words to name what happened, they can reconstruct it. So the party goes one step further. It eliminates inconvenient words. That is Newspeak. 1984 suggests that by the year 2050, certain thoughts would literally be impossible to formulate. Orwell developed this idea while working at the BBC, where institutional language systematically reduced and simplified thought. He expanded it in his essay Politics in the English Language, written in 1946, 3 years before publishing 1984. In that essay, he warned of something very precise. When language degrades, political thought degrades with it. Today, no decree is needed to impose Newspeak because almost no one says civilian deaths anymore, but collateral damage. We prefer special military operation instead of invasion, or conflict instead of genocide. Sometimes it's imposed by decree, sometimes adopted by the media, sometimes repeated by us without realizing it, but the effect is the same. Every time we use a euphemism, we give up a little ground to the truth, as Orwell warned us. And he also warned that those who seek free thought would end up in room 101. It is not a conventional torture chamber. There are no instruments, no predefined methods. Because what is inside room 101 depends on each person. It contains your deepest fear, not a generic fear, but yours, the specific one, the one that makes you lose your mind. In the book, the protagonist has a phobia of rats, and that is precisely what the party places in front of his face. The name, by the way, comes from a meeting room at the BBC's broadcasting house, where Orwell endured some of the worst meetings of his life. He took that number and turned it into the ultimate image of personalized terror. Because the most effective terror, he said, is not physical. Today, room 101 has no walls. Social media algorithms know what enrages you, what embarrasses you, and what terrifies you. Not because they spy on you in the traditional sense, but because you've been telling them yourself, post by post for years. Public shaming, collective outrage, the exposure of private mistakes to thousands of strangers. Fear hasn't disappeared, it has just found new rooms. And even so, the party's most sophisticated mechanism is not surveillance, nor rewriting the past, nor manipulating language. It is getting people to do it themselves. That is doublethink. It is the most uncomfortable concept of all, because it's not about power, it's about us. It is the ability to believe two contradictory things at the same time and feel no discomfort about it. Orwell built it from the party's slogans. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. He observed European intellectuals of the 1930s and 40s, people who admired Stalin even as reports of the gulags emerged, forced labor camps where more than 1.5 million people died in purges, informed, intelligent people who simply chose not to look because changing their minds carried too high a social cost. Doublethink is not stupidity, it is a decision. We see it in those who defend a leader doing exactly what they once condemned in others. We see it in those who consume news only from media outlets that already agree with them. We see it in those who know something is false and share it anyway, because the ends justify the means. Orwell never knew that 1984 would become the great political novel of the 20th century, and the most uncomfortable warning of the 21st. He never knew his 5 concepts would enter dictionaries around the world. He never knew that decades later, every time a government lied, someone would call it Orwellian. But there is a question that hangs over all of this. Was it of any use? If Big Brother is still watching, if ministries of truth are still erasing, if Newspeak is still spreading, if Room 101 has found new walls, and doublethink remains a daily choice, what was the book for? To name it. And naming something is the first step to recognizing it. Before Orwell, we didn't have precise words to describe these mechanisms. We experienced them, sensed them, but we couldn't point to them. Orwell gave us the vocabulary, and whoever has the vocabulary has the ability to see. At this point, we can say that 1984 was not a prediction, it was an autopsy. The problem is that seeing is not enough, because these mechanisms have not disappeared, quite the opposite. They have evolved and found their most sophisticated form in something Orwell never got to know. Today, it's not called Big Brother, it's called the algorithm. It's not called the Ministry of Truth, it's called fake news.